As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world, and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our sinful natures and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath, but because of this great love for us, God, who is rich in memory, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved.
Thanks, Carson. Excuse me while I make a pit stop. Not that kind of pit stop. Oh, Carson, would you bring me the Bible back, please? Thanks. I try to base my sermons on the Bible. Thank you. She's fast, isn't she? It's great. That's why I like to have young people reading. Well, today we move from looking at the topic of resurrection. We move from looking at it in Luke's gospel to looking at it from Paul's point of view, and now we're reading from Ephesians, as you heard Carson read. We want to consider in these next few messages how it is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ impacts us today. Paul does two things in these verses, Ephesians 2, 1-5. First of all, he describes just how spiritually dead people are without Christ, before conversion. And then he tells how people are made alive by God, who resurrects us, who raises us together with Christ. So today we're going to hear a message about spiritual deadness and about spiritual life. I think it's always a good idea when opening the Bible to take a look at the previous section. And in this case, we're opening chapter 2, so let's have a look at the closing verses of chapter 1, verses 17 to 22. In this section, it's a long prayer is what it is, and Paul's praying for the church. It's a glorious, magnificent, inspiring prayer. He prays that God, the glorious Father, may give the church the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that we can know him better, that the eyes of our heart may be enlightened or opened. That's where we get that song, "Open the Eyes of My Heart, Lord," so that we can know the hope, the certainty of the hope to which he's called us, the riches of our inheritance in his great power. And then here's, I think, a key verse, the end of 19, the beginning of 20, that ties in with what we're talking about today. The power is like the working of his mighty strength, which he exerted in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms. He's talking about the power that we have available to us as Christians is the same power that God used when he raised Jesus Christ from the dead. And now in chapter 2, Paul's going to expand on that. And so what he does now as we turn to chapter 2, he turns from the glory of this heavenly prayer to the sometimes sobering reality of just how spiritually dead we are without Christ in our lives. Did you ever walk out of church and maybe it was a particularly good worship service, you know, the message was good, there was a rousing postlude, and there were praise songs around the service, and it just hit you right, and you walk out of church and you get into your car and then you get home and you start thinking, man, that was great, but I got all these problems. I mean, my life is just kind of messed up today, and it has been for a while. That was great, but, you know, what about reality? How do I connect what happened in the sanctuary with the reality of my life? And Paul here in this section of Ephesians 2, this first section, he writes, "You were dead." And you might say he's overstating spirituality, but he's really stating the reality of where we are in our lives without that vital day-by-day connection with God. Paul is talking about people who know Christ now, And he reminds them, and he reminds us that the spiritual life which we now enjoy is actually not a natural thing. It's a new thing. It's a gift from God. Before we received that gift, we were spiritually dead. Now we're spiritually alive in him if we're trusting Christ. But back then, we were spiritually dead. And so he's contrasting so the church can see, as they reach out to the world, the contrast between death and life, between spiritual vitality and spiritual deadness. As we go on to look at verses 1 to 3, we see that Paul raises some different ways in which we can understand and see our spiritual deadness without Christ. Death is kind of like pregnancy. Either you are or you aren't. Isn't that true? But by showing us these different ways in which we experience spiritual death, it is almost like Paul is saying, you not only were dead without Christ, you were really, completely, totally, flatly, spiritually dead. You were really dead. It's like saying you're really pregnant. He's emphasizing it by looking at it from different angles. He's saying you're unable to do anything for yourselves spiritually without God's help. And theologians call this the doctrine of total depravity, that there's no way for us to lift ourselves up. We're so far gone that only God, the way he raised Jesus from the dead, can raise us out of our spiritual death. The first thing I think Paul shows us about our spiritual deadness is that we were dead in our lifestyle. Verse 1 says it this way, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. This is one idea, I think, expressed with two words for emphasis. The general, sin, and the specific, transgression. Sin is the general word we all know. It means to act against God, to see what is right and then to shoot in a different direction, to miss the mark. Transgression is specific language. Sin is general language for sinning. Transgression is specific language for sinning. It's the language of going against, crossing the boundary that's set up by God's laws, acting against God's commandments, the code that God has established for good in our lives and in the world. And so what Paul's saying is that before we knew Christ, we were dead in our lifestyle. Our lifestyle did not take God into account. We lived as if God had simply not spoken. We lived as if God had not spoken, or at least as if we knew about God speaking, but we chose not to listen. We did what was wrong generally against God and against ourselves and against others, sin. And specifically, we broke God's law. We transgressed against God's law. The second angle on our deadness comes in verse 2, where Paul writes, we were dead in our value system. Verse 2 says this, you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit, who is now at work in those who are disobedient. We let the world and its values tell us what to do. Without Christ, and here's the spirituality language that's in here, kingdom of the air, Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. Without Christ, we were open to the dangers of false spirituality. Without knowing the true God, we opened ourselves up to that which is false and dangerous. So we followed the ways of the world, we let the world tell us what to do, and without Christ we opened ourselves up to a false kind of spirituality. We were dead in our value system.